Good morning. I'm reminded of the film, if you've seen it, Shakespeare in Love, where the guy comes in when Shakespeare's scribbling away, and Shakespeare, sort of moans at him, "Who are you?" And he said, "I am the money," because he was the producer. So I'm the money as far as defense is concerned. There are two basic interacting questions, aren't there? The one is about political risk to commercial investments that come from global security challenges that I will speak only very briefly about. And what are the implications of those global security challenges for economic stability and growth? And of course, one of the ways that governments try to deal with those political risks is by investing in defense. And therefore, that raises lots of questions about how much they spend, where is it going, and where will it go in the future, which is my starting point. Now, first thing is that all the data about defense should carry a health warning. That getting accurate figures, everybody has roughly. Everything's an approximation. It's in different currencies. You've got purchasing power and things like that. Countries include different things within defense. Some countries have a gendarmerie that they put in defense. UK doesn't have a gendarmerie, doesn't include it in defense. Some people have a gendarmerie and put it outside defense. So you've got there are health warnings with all the data. The other thing about defense, which is, as far as the media are concerned, is that even small projects are pretty big. In the UK Ministry of Defence, frankly, £2 million is not very much. Yeah? But £2 million on a quiet news day that's been wasted on a project can be front page in quite a few newspapers. Yeah? Because the Ministry of Defence, it's a central spending department. Most government departments, their money is distributed into the country to different education authorities and health authorities. So defence projects, even small ones, are quite notable numbers. And large projects are very costly. The thing that you saw sailing under the Forth Bridge yesterday was about £3.5–4 billion going under the bridge. So that's chunk of real money, and increasingly so. There is in defence an observation made back in the 80s, which is by a man called Norman Augustine, who worked for Northrop Grumman. He worked for Martin Marietta. He was the boss, and he is still around and still says his law is in place. Augustine's law says that in the year 2054, if current trends continue, the entire US budget will be devoted to defense budget will be devoted to the purchase of a single aeroplane. Because what we've got is, as you go from one generation of equipment to another, as you go from the, if you like, Typhoon to the F-35, if you've probably heard of those, they tend to increase by 2 to 3 times in real terms on what the previous generation cost. So defense projects are like that. They're what some economists call tournament goods. There's huge advantages to having the best and huge disadvantages in having the second best, because that's really bad news sometimes. There are various sources of data, and I put some of them there. So if you ever wanted to look in more detail, you could have a dig yourself. They all produce data on global defense spending. Countries, when you look at that number, you have to remember that some countries put things into their defense budget that don't contribute to defense at all. Most obvious example is all the pension payments that are made to service people who are long retired. In some countries, we've taken to putting the pensions into the defense budget. They don't really contribute to defense. But in other countries, keep things out of the defense budget that do contribute to defense. So the Chinese, for instance, are very fond of, they'll put development work and research and development work that's focused on defense, but it's in the Ministry of Industry or something. It's not in the defense sector. What you see when you start to look at the numbers, it doesn't really matter whose numbers you look at, is the way that the US dominates military expenditure in the world. You'll see it's about 40%. Although it's crept up in the last 3 years, it's actually been going down over the last 20 years because other countries, particularly China and Saudi Arabia and others, have been spending more. But if you really want to know where, if you just simple question, who spends money on defense, the answer is the United States. It's about 40% of the total. It is, I say, the longer term trend is that it's going down, but for the last 3 years it's gone up, partly because of the pressure on Russia and the Russian defense budget's been going down. If you look at Europe, then you've got a similar concentration where you've got actually 3 or 4 countries dominate. There are something like 36 countries that are counted as Europe in the, and about 25, 26 in NATO Europe. Actually, nearly all the money is spent by UK, France, Germany, and to a lesser extent, Italy. You can see the percentages there. So you've got the top 4 countries in Europe are spending 2/3 of all European defense expenditure. So if you get, as you do get President Trump saying Europeans have got to spend more, some countries spending more would make a big difference, other countries spending more wouldn't make a lot of difference because of this distribution. If Germany went to spending 2% of GDP, which is what President Trump has been arguing for, the German defense budget would be 1.5 times that of the UK. So that's quite an interesting statistic in itself for its political implications. The figures reflect politics. And I think I won't dwell on this, but there are 2 sort of major things. You've got Russian assertiveness and Chinese assertiveness. Now, Russian assertiveness is of a country that is striving to maintain influence, striving to maintain power from a background of a struggling economy. It's obviously under sanctions, energy prices are going down, but actually Russia doesn't manufacture anything very much. Yeah? We don't buy any manufactured goods from Russia. It's interesting, if you look at the statistics on the Russian economy, try and find what they make and sell overseas, and the answer to that is largely defense equipment, actually. That's by far their biggest sale, and they tend to sell that to countries that we might be reluctant to sell to. Now, currently, their official defense spending, and notice the word official, is going down. What they're doing in Russia is focusing defense effort on Western vulnerabilities. They're not trying to match Western efforts across the piece. They're trying to focus on what are seen as our vulnerabilities, and the most obvious area is cyber. Yeah, but we could come back to that. And also with surveillance and missile systems. Missile systems that are precise and increasingly of long range. Now, so this is the area of missiles is an interesting one about numbers, because when you look at the cost of a missile, it looks expensive. Yeah, it looks expensive, but actually, when you think of what it would hit and destroy, then it's not expensive. If you take a long-range cruise missile that maybe costs $500,000, that's a chunk of money. So I will think about firing 10 of them. So I spent $5 million. If I can hit a Type 45, which cost £1 billion, if I can hit an aircraft carrier that costs £3.5–4 billion, that's a very interesting exchange. It's a financially tricky. So the Russians, and to a certain extent the Chinese, have been focusing their efforts in specific areas where they perceive that we might be vulnerable. Now, the Chinese are sort of different to Russia. They're being assertive because they feel that now, with their sustained economic advance, they're entitled to standing and respect and power in the world, and certainly in their region. They understate their defense budget, and they say it's 1.3%, but we believe it's real terms much bigger than that. They are moving in terms of their armed forces. They're moving from having a very large numerically large in terms of people armed forces to more capital intensive. And again, they're trying to look at Western vulnerabilities. Now, these other things going on, North Korea, Iran, and the Middle East, Iran certainly is a customer for equipment, particularly from Russia. And of course, we've seen the end of the Iraq and Afghanistan campaign, so that's affected our defense spending. What do we think? I think Germany's going to edge up over an extended period, probably. Not because President Trump wants them to, but because they think they can't really rely on the Americans, yeah, which is a different point. Yeah? And I think France the same. The UK is committed to spending 2% of GDP on defence. The UK has a major problem in defence from the devaluation of the pound. Yeah? My calculation, now the MOD doesn't quite agree, so I'll knock something off, but my calculation was that the devaluation of the pound has knocked about £600 million a year off Ministry of Defence spending power. Now let's say that's I haven't got time to tell you the calculation, but let's say it's an exaggeration. Let's say it's only £400 million. But that's every year that the pound is less than 150. Yeah, it's down at 130. So, and then there's the question of the impact of Brexit, which says, well, okay, we're going to be spending 2% of GDP, but what's GDP going to be? If GDP goes down, there's even less money. So there are currently major financial stresses in the Ministry of Defence, and they're not, I think, going to get any better. How we spend our money is a function of politics, it's a function of economics, it's a function of technology. You'll see if you look at the sort of world of politics and defence, you'll hear this phrase, anti-access area denial. And this is really referring to the efforts, particularly of Russia and China, and to a certain extent Iran, to make it very hazardous to put our ships and large aircraft in certain areas that we need to deploy them to if we're going to be an international presence. Now, defence budgets and expenditures are inputs. They're not necessarily outputs, let alone operationally based outcomes, which are even trickier. Most countries in the world, if we move to the global picture, most countries in the world spend a lot of their defence budget, or even most of their defence budget, on salaries. Yeah? So, just to see, look at the difference. We have good numbers for this because of NATO, but you can see the UK, the US, spending only less than 40% of our defence spending goes on people. Yeah? So the rest is going on goods and services that you're buying from outside. So you're adding value to the people. Yeah? In other countries, you look at Belgium. Belgium spends 77% of its defence budget on salaries. Now, if you say, so I don't know if there are any Belgians present, but what you get when you do that is you get quite a lot of what I call warm bodies. Yeah? Because they don't have any equipment and they don't have any training, because you spend 80% of your defence budget on their salary. Yeah? So if you want to think about what outputs you're getting from defence spending, one of the things to try and check is try and see how much they're spending on personnel. Now, the figures vary a bit from country to country because the UK and the US are very heavily dependent on outsourced services. Other countries use military or government personnel, so they go into the salaries bit. And whereas when we outsource it, it goes into the services bit, so it becomes a procurement expenditure. Yeah? So you can't take too much. France, for instance, doesn't outsource nearly so much. A lot more work is done by French government people. Similarly, Germany doesn't outsource so much. But question, have a quick look. That's one of the things that you can have a look at to see where the money's going and what it means. Key information is how much is being spent on new capital. as it is in many capital-intensive. Defence is a capital-intensive activity in commercial terms. And how much is going on equipment and therefore capability priorities? How much is being spent on research and development, and how much is being spent on equipment support? Now, we have these good numbers only for Western, well, actually for NATO countries, because they report and publicise this information. So we don't have this information on a lot of countries. They keep it, it's sensitive, and they keep it classified. But just to give you, if I just show you this laser, yeah? This is the equipment expenditure. So you can see that the United States, France, the United Kingdom all spend about a quarter of their defence money on new equipment. Yeah? That includes the research, that includes the development spending, but they're all up there. Whereas when you look at Italy, well, Italy's had a bit of a boost, but you can see these numbers. You can see look at Belgium. Yeah? Belgium, that with all that money on personnel, yeah, actually spends next to nothing on equipment. And you can see there's quite a disparity amongst the members. You've got the figures in your slide pack, so you can look through at any country of interest. Traditionally, some of that reflected what kind of forces you had. If you're landlocked, you don't have a navy. Navies and air forces are capital-intensive organisations because even with you can't get into the air without an aircraft. That's the deal. So if you don't have any aircraft, you don't have an air force. It's very difficult to fight and swim. So if you don't have a navy, if you don't have ships, you don't have a navy. But if you have 10,000 people who can pick up pieces of furniture and put petrol into bottles, and you've got an army of some description. Yeah. So traditionally, navies and air forces, if you have a big navy and a big air force, you're going to be more capital intensive than if you have an army. Now, some of these numbers are this sort of thing is changing. First of all, because armies are becoming using more and more sophisticated equipment. This is an Apache helicopter. An Apache helicopter costs about $30,000 an hour to fly, yeah, and it's an army system. Yeah? This is the Scout vehicle, which is the latest thing that's going to be is being bought by the British Army. It's it's various versions of it, but those are £7 million a copy. Yeah? So there are land systems, yes? So they're changing the capital-intensive nature of land systems. The other element of change is that for all the services, or for defence in general, space is ever more important for navigation, for surveillance, for targeting, for all communication, all kinds of other purposes, and of course cyberspace. Yeah? So the extent to which defence is about clunky pieces of kit like that, and what it's about cyberspace is a changing mix. So now this is the figure for the this is the figures it's a diagram that shows you how the money is being distributed for the next 10 years for the UK. And you can see that most of the cyber spending, as it were, is up in that top. That's Joint Force Command. That's got responsibility for that. But you can see they're roughly equal. They vary a bit. Yeah, that's the nuclear piece. That's the deterrent, yeah, and the replacement of the deterrent. And that is a major source of cost. Now, you'll see lots of political arguments about whether you're in favour of Trident or you're not in favour of Trident and Trident replacement. The issue is, if you're in favour of it, what's the financial limit of your being in favour of it? Because it's going up and up. Spending on support reflects training efforts. So how much you're trying to add value to the people that you've got. NATO figures hide it. There's variation among states. Basically, if you don't spend very much in the NATO category of other, that means you're not doing much training and you're not looking after the equipment. You're not buying a lot of spare parts and so on. Now, support for people not new to defence is a very, very significant item of expenditure. Generally speaking, many pieces of military equipment cost more to look after than they do to buy, which is a bit of a shock. This is the that's equipment, that's new equipment spending, and that lot is support spending. Yeah? So we spend as much on support as we do on new equipment. And for an individual piece of equipment, the actual spending's often, usually more. Now, actually, they shouldn't be surprised, because if you actually do a quick calculation, do the minimal spreadsheet, and say, what did I spend, what did I pay for my car? And then say, okay, over a decade, how much do I spend on insurance? How much do I spend on services? How much do I spend on fuel? How much do I spend on tax? Blah, blah, a few repairs. You'll find it comes pretty near to what you paid for the car in the first place. Now, these things, the pictures I showed you, they require, Apache helicopter is 10 to 12 hours, man-hours of maintenance for every flight hour. So you can start to see that the costs go up. But this is, these are, you can see the way, you can also see from this the way that the Ministry of Defence tries to plan. This is a slide just to illustrate the cost of support. This is a sort of standard slide that's used in the United States. But basically, research and development often costs about that much, production costs about that much, and then supporting over its life costs that much. Yeah? Often countries, I tell people, you know, fathers in the room, we all remember when, if you're a father, you remember your wife being pregnant forever, and you know, you're waiting and waiting, and eventually, if you're fortunate, your wife goes into labour and she gives birth, and you're looking at this new human being, and as a man, you say, "Oh, thank goodness that's over." And that lasts about 2 minutes, and you go, "No, it's not. It's just starting." Well. Buying military equipment is a bit like that. you think, I've paid for it, great, and then it's sitting there. Just I would say that of countries that buy major systems, they have more problems finding the money to look after it than they do finding the money to buy it in the first place. It's just one of those realities. So, as we look forward a little bit and say, where will money go, then one of the things which we've argued in the Institute, and I think will be right, is that the UK uses a structure called Defence Capability Framework. Yeah? And this is the Defence Capability Framework. And it says, essentially, if I run through it very quickly, it says you need to get your forces where they need to act. So that's project. That's the kind of how do you get there? Yeah, that's project. You have to be able to move. You need to be able to find out what's going on. Yeah, so that's inform. You've got all the surveillance, intelligence, all that. You need to be able to give instructions and communicate. So that's the command function. It's the communication command. And then you need to do stuff, whatever it is that you do. That's operate. It might be go on a patrol. It might be put a bomb on a target, whatever. That's operate, yeah? And then what happens is in the cycle is that having done something, you then inform yourself as to the result of what you've done, and then you decide something else to do, and then you do it, and you keep going around like that. Yeah, it's called the OODA loop in military terms. Now, those get to where you need to be, inform, command, operate. How long can you keep going? Yeah, how long can you have to be able to sustain the effort? Can you sustain it for 1 month, 2 months, 6 months? Yeah. So that's sustain. What's the logistics part of it? And you have to be able to prepare. If you can't train, you can't do. Yeah? So why is prepare put in that prominent place? Because it costs such a lot of money. Yeah? You may need simulators. You may have physical difficulties. The Singaporean Air Force, where does the Singaporean Air Force train? It trains in France and the United States. Because when you take off in Singapore and do anything, you're in somebody else's airspace and you can't practice combat. Yeah? Now, and maybe you use simulators a lot more. Yeah? So the prepare piece. Now, that's the defense capabilities framework. What we anticipate is that the top one of those, protect. You have to be able to protect your assets so that you can keep doing all this. Yeah? If any of these is disrupted, your ability throughout collapses. And I think we'll see more attention paid to protection. You're seeing this in the United States. We've been doing close work with the United States. You'll see that. So anybody that's in the electronic warfare area, anybody that's in the missile defense area, anybody that's in the cyber protection area, those sorts of things, they're the things that are going to be, get attention in budgets because of this focused effort by Russia and China and its friends that I mentioned. What we're seeing are some emerging technologies like these. We're seeing electromagnetic guns. They're a bit like electric cars. The gun technology is getting quite good, but the generation of electricity to propel them is another issue. Yeah? Laser weapons. The Americans have just tested a laser weapon on an Apache helicopter. Now got an Apache that's big enough to carry a laser weapon. Destroyed a truck, I think, that they hit with it. As an experiment. So we're seeing these new things come along. The advantage of these two technologies is that you can get very rapid fire. And the logistics aspect, you don't have to have hundreds of shells or dozens of missiles. You can just keep firing because as long as you're generating electricity, you can generate lasers. And these electric guns, they just fire a solid block of material. So and what we can see actually across the US and here is that we're seeing an emphasis on innovation to deal with these problems that I talked about China and Russia. The emphasis on innovation means to a certain extent unpredictability, but it also means that new companies can come into defense. Perhaps General Atomics has come out of nowhere because it makes that system there, the Predator system, the Reaper we call it in the UK. But on the other hand, the major contractors still have great advantages. They're good at integrating large systems in challenging domains. They're very good at doing business with governments, particularly the American government. Yeah, that's a core competence. Any of you go to Washington, you'll be aware that as you drive into Washington, you'll see big, buildings outside with Raytheon and Northrop Grumman and Lockheed written on the side. And you think, oh, that's an interesting place to put a factory. It isn't a factory. It's a lobbying institution. And they also have very significant capital access. So all the major defense contractors, for instance, have bought their way into the cyber world, yeah? And have become that. In terms of how the money is, in terms of equipment, it runs. Big projects dominate. Yeah? Most of the money goes to a small number of projects, and particularly platforms, and most of the money goes to a small number of firms. And they're quite famous firms. These are the top 10 in the world, and I put some more detail into the appendix in the slide. But they're all, I think, pretty familiar names to you. Perhaps not Leonardo, but that used to be Finmeccanica, and they've rebranded themselves. Very few states have got the capacity or expertise to develop their own defense equipment. So they rely on imports. But more and more states are trying to develop their defense industrial capabilities so that they can do more in their own defense industrial base. And they do that in part through technology transfer and making technology transfer of one sort an intrinsic part of a deal. And of course, companies are very wary about transferring technology. So we see defense export policies proliferate around the world. Predominant feature of if you like, of world armed forces is that more countries are looking to do more for themselves in the manufacture and development and support of equipment. Yeah? They're not content just to rely on other businesses. These are the major importing nations as far as defense equipment is concerned. You see the country at the front is much larger. Saudi Arabia has a larger defense budget than the UK. Yeah, you look up. India is still importing a lot, but particularly from Russia. USA is a bit misleading because the US, you've got to remember the US budget in the first place is 40% of the world. The US imports a minuscule proportion of its defense spend. Minuscule proportion of its defense spend. It's less than 1%. Yeah? We import about 20 to 30% of our defense needs. Yeah? So it's completely different. But those are the major defense markets. So when you've got an organization that's trying to promote defense exports, if you're looking at big platforms, things that are expensive, then it's these countries and a few more that you're going to be targeting. You don't target a lot of smaller countries. Remember, there are about, I think about at least 170 countries that run armed forces. Yeah? So those account for the great majority of customers. These are the numbers that the Congressional Research Service puts up. And again, with the arms trade, you've got no reliable figures. You just hope that they measure the same things different people measure the same things year on year, so you get comparable figures. It's quite a small number of countries. In conclusion, the US dominates defense acquisition by value. It actually dominates also the world defense export market by value, as you would expect. US companies dominate the global defense trade. It's a comparatively small number of companies. The companies often form virtually national monopolies. And defense is a funny business. You tend to have, on the one side, you have a monopoly or at best an oligopoly. And on the other side, you've got a monopsony, a single buyer. So their relationships are interesting. The entry barriers for countries that want to come in are very high in the major platforms areas. The combination of money and knowledge that you need, if you said, if I said to any of you, if I said, here's 10 billion pounds, now I'll give you, in 10 years' time, you can burn that money, but here's 10 billion pounds. At the end of a decade, you must have created a missile company that can rival MBDA. You wouldn't do it. Yeah? And you certainly wouldn't get anywhere near a combat aircraft, because the kind of mixture of money and knowledge and that exists in these big companies is so difficult to reproduce. So what you see around the world is you see efforts to build combat aircraft by countries like South Korea, even Japan, and they always end up costing a lot more and not working very well because the entry barriers are so much. We may be seeing significant change because if we do have a lot of innovation in defense equipment, that can open up for new types of system and new companies. China is becoming a significant supplier of defense equipment now, and Chinese technology, full stop, is much better than Russian technology, and that's reflected in their defense equipment. And you've got lots of countries which have got defense industrial ambitions that they're now trying to fund. So I'm not sure how I've done for time. I'm looking at but that's a bit of a quick skate through about where the money goes in defense. Thank you very much. Yeah.